You meet a guy, you're on the pill, you think he's great, you come off the pill, and all of a sudden, you're kind of not interested anymore.
Welcome to Wellness, your ultimate guide to unlocking your full human potential through biohacking. I'm your host, Ashley Deely. I'm a certified sports nutrition coach, former personal trainer, and Pilates instructor, and I have a degree in kinesiology. My goal is to help you improve the quality of your life. When you leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, it helps listeners just like you find this hidden health information faster. If you're using Bluetooth headphones, it's seriously time to upgrade your health. Bluetooth headphones are constantly emitting EMFs, which means they can cause headaches, fatigue, ringing in the ears, tinnitus, and even fertility issues. Thankfully, there's a lot of ways to reduce your exposure. The first one is to stop using Bluetooth headphones. The headphones I use are unlike any regular headphones because they use a hollow air tube between the speaker and the earbud, therefore reducing EMF exposure. These headphones also work with any adapter, and they have a handy little microphone as well as a pause and play button for you to take calls, listen to music, or podcasts. To find out which headphones I'm talking about, visit ashleydeely.com/headphones. That's ashleydeely.com/headphones, so you can stop using Bluetooth and upgrade your listening activities. America hasn't updated its beauty laws in over 80 years, and the cosmetics industry is highly unregulated. But ARAZA Beauty is the first paleo-certified makeup line in the US, made with real ingredients you can pronounce. Their formulas are nourishing and actually good for your skin. They promote that youthful glow and high performance results. Visit ARAZABeauty.com/Ashley Deely, ARAZA. That's ARAZABeauty.com/Ashley Deely. Today's guest is Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. She was featured on Welcome to Wellness, episode 109, where we dove into heavy periods, IUDs, different options for birth control, and what it really means to empower women by understanding their cycles. If you haven't checked it out, I would highly recommend going back. But for today, Lisa is a best-selling author, educator, and host of the popular podcast, Fertility Friday. She's passionate about helping women connect deeply with their menstrual cycles, which she calls the fifth vital sign. Through her books, The Fifth Vital Sign, Real Food for Fertility, and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, Lisa has brought evidence-based, research-rich knowledge to thousands of women worldwide. Her Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship equips health professionals with the tools to better support their clients through cycle tracking and fertility awareness. She's here today to share why understanding your cycle is one of the most empowering things you can do for your health and well-being. If you've ever felt confused about cycle days, unsure how to track your fertility, not sure when you ovulate, or how to have a conversation with your teenage daughter about her body and sex, this is an episode you won't want to miss. Lisa, welcome to Wellness.
Thank you for having me back.
Oh, that's my favorite part, is having you back. This is why I love having my own show, because when I resonate with someone, I get to have them back.
It's super fun. Highly recommend it.
Yes. Okay. I have lots of questions for you today. And the first one I have comes with a little bit of a story, because I recently told this woman that she needed to get her blood drawn between day 19 and 21. And she goes, that's 19 days after my period, right? So where I want to start today, Lisa, is with cycle charting. What is day one? And can you walk us through it?
Yes, absolutely. So day one of your cycle is day one of your period. And I would say that the caveat is day one of your true flow. And so some women may experience spotting before their period actually starts, but we wouldn't consider those days to be the start of your period. So anyone who's had a period knows that there's a point at which it starts and you start flowing, and that would be day one. And I would take it even a step further, because you recommended her doing testing based on a certain cycle day. So that can be problematic, because not every woman ovulates on day 14 or 15. So for example, the day 21 progesterone testing is intended to catch mid-luteal, and that's assuming that she's ovulating around day 14, and 7 days after that would be day 21, and that would be the mid-luteal. That would be the peak time to test for progesterone. But what if she ovulates on day 19? What if she ovulates on day 12? And so charting can even help you to be a little bit more accurate, less date dependent, and more, it's obviously less convenient for the medical professionals, but more because you can't necessarily predict that in advance, but it does give a more accurate picture. Because some women are going for these 21-day progesterones, or day 21 progesterone, or day 19, and it's like, oh, you have no progesterone. But it's like, well, no, she doesn't, because she hasn't ovulated yet. But so the test is like meaningless unless it's done at the right time.
Oh my gosh. Okay, this is so fascinating because I've always been told test between days 19 and 21. So I'm really glad you're shedding some light on that. Day 1 is where there's flow, even though there might be spotting beforehand. Can you walk us through the phases of the cycle?
Sure. I kind of skipped that part, went straight to the progesterone. So absolutely. So separate the menstrual cycle into 4 phases or 2 phases, depending on what you want to do. We can talk about before ovulation, so the pre-ovulatory or follicular phase, and then we can talk about after ovulation, which would be the post-ovulatory or luteal phase. And we can also break the cycle down into, the menstrual phase, and then, the follicular, and then ovulation, and then the post, like the luteal phase, and back to the menstrual. The period marks the beginning of your cycle. Like I said, day 1 is the first day of your flow. And once your period comes to an end, we are in the follicular phase. What we typically expect to see as we approach ovulation would be several days of mucus. So typically, 2 to 7 days of cervical fluid. And that can look like your creamy white hand lotion. That can look like raw, egg whites. So that kind of clear, stretchy. And that typically we're seeing as we approach ovulation. And the reason that we're seeing that is because as you are in that follicular phase, you are moving towards ovulation. The follicles are starting to develop and grow. And as they develop and grow, they're producing estrogen. And estrogen is what is stimulating that mucus production. It's also stimulating the development of the endometrial lining. So really preparing you for ovulation. And once that estrogen reaches a certain peak, that is what ends up triggering ovulation. So that kind of sends a feedback loop, kind of like your thermostat in your house. And that is what ultimately causes ovulation. And so once you ovulate, then you produce a significant amount of progesterone. So throughout the first half of the cycle, you're not really producing significant progesterone. So that's why I said, if you're testing for progesterone, but you haven't ovulated yet, you're like looking for, I don't know, you're looking for a carburetor at, I don't know, I just make up really silly examples. Like you went to the corner store and you're looking for like a forklift. So you're not gonna find it. So after ovulation, the egg is released and the follicle turns into what's called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts making progesterone. The progesterone significantly rises. And then that's why mid-luteal is that prime time to test for those progesterone levels, because typically about 7-ish days after ovulation is when progesterone would hit its peak. If you're not pregnant, if you don't conceive that cycle, it'll gradually drop down in a typical healthy cycle. If you do become pregnant, it'll keep going up for months, which is pretty exciting. And then, typically in a healthy cycle after ovulation, about 12 to 14 days later, that's when you have your next period.
Thank you. That was so concise. And I like the example of looking for a forklift at the corner store. How can we tell if we've ovulated?
So that's a great question. There's different ways to do it. As a fertility awareness instructor, we can confirm ovulation with cervical mucus. So as I mentioned, we produce the cervical mucus leading up to ovulation. Once you've ovulated, the progesterone rises, and that progesterone suppresses the effects of estrogen. So it kind of shuts down that mucus production. So for some women, they can see that they have all the cervical fluid, like they're going to the bathroom, they're wiping, and whoosh, like their hands hitting the back of the toilet, their underwear is full of all this great stuff. They're kind of like, or if they're tracking, they're wiping and they're looking at it and they're picking it up and seeing how much it stretches, depending on, choose your own adventure there. But once that mucus then dries up and goes away, that's one way to confirm ovulation. If you're in the weeds with charting and you're taking your temperature, so the basal body temperature, that would be, putting the thermometer in your mouth first thing when you wake up in the morning and tracking it throughout your cycle. So because progesterone has a thermogenic effect on the body, after ovulation, the progesterone rises and so does your metabolic rate. And it's really fascinating. I mean, that's why I've been in this field for so long, because it really is an incredible system in our bodies. So when you see what's called a sustained thermal shift. So you're taking your temperature each day, first thing before you get out of bed. Your pre-ovulatory temperatures tend to be within a certain range. And then after ovulation, you would see the temperature rise and stay high. So you're kind of looking at this graph. All of a sudden the temperatures go up and they kind of stay above the line. So there's a separation between those pre-ov and post-ov temps. That's another way to confirm ovulation. Obviously, a progesterone test is also a fantastic way to test for ovulation because that will confirm it. Because like I said, you're not producing significant progesterone until ovulation. So that is definitely one of the ways to confirm. But I don't know about you, but I don't have a lab or a lab tech in my house. So the BBT or the mucus is a little bit more user-friendly, if you will.
Okay, that's great. And what about LH tests?
LH test. So I kind of alluded to that, but I didn't call it out by name. So I mentioned that when you're moving to ovulation, your estrogen is rising high. And once it hits a certain peak, it's, causing this feedback system. So what happens is when the estrogen raises high, it sends a message back to the pituitary, and then you release LH. And the best analogy that I've heard of that is from my colleague, Dr. Marguerite Duane. And she described LH as the pin. And if you think about the ovary at ovulation or the follicle as a balloon. And so the LH is what
Okay.
triggers ovulation, triggers that release of the egg. Typically then these ovulation strips are testing for LH. There's a lot that I could say about that. One thing is that the LH strips are typically turning positive about, 24 to 36 hours before ovulation. So when you're seeing the LH strip, it does not confirm that you have ovulated. It is telling you that you will likely ovulate within the next 24 to 36 hours. Another thing to consider is that these are test strips. They're actually not like what they're doing, if we want to be like literal, is the strip is programmed to turn positive when the LH reaches a certain threshold. So that does mean that if you are taking your test and the urine is really diluted, you could get like a false negative. And there are times when you could get a false positive. So it's just helpful to be aware of that, just so that you understand what it's actually doing, which is that it's been programmed. And not all strips have the same programming. So some of them might be programmed to be more sensitive or less sensitive. So that, but at the end of the day, it doesn't confirm ovulation, but it's testing for the LH, which is typically released before ovulation is actually happening. And one thing I'll mention is that women with PCOS, for example, are known to have elevated LH, and that's part of the condition. It's characterized by delayed ovulation, and rapid LH pulsing is part of this process. So I talk a lot more specifically about that in the PCOS chapter of Real Food for Fertility. So, for example, some women are going to see a lot of positives, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a confirmation of ovulation. So it is, that's an exception, that's a small percentage of women who would fall into that category. But I think it is helpful because, as you know, I'm sure a lot of women do use the ovulation strips as like a confirmation of ovulation, like they have already. And what we know from charting is that you can have a positive LH and not ovulate right away. Your body could be moving towards ovulation and you could see something like that. And then maybe something stressful happens and it's delayed for a few days. So the best practice would be to understand the signs that you're moving towards ovulation, tracking your cervical fluid, understanding the role of the LH test, and then confirming ovulation with one of the 3 ways that I said before. So looking at the mucus, looking at the temperature, or, getting a blood draw.
That was such a solid answer. And so if we have normal cycles, will we always ovulate?
That's an interesting question. I would first of all be like, well, what do you define as a normal cycle? So I go there. So how do I answer that question? Let me think. One of the just reality, like the reality of the situation is that if you're not tracking your cycle and you're not closely kind of paying attention, you don't necessarily know whether or not you're ovulating. Like we can assume, and I'm not trying to scare people and act like, but I'm just saying that there are times when you can have bleeding that actually looks like a period and not ovulate. So for example, it's called an anovulatory cycle, and I've seen them. And so I have had clients where they're charting and they do not have a temp shift. They kind of have mucus sporadically. And, for some clients, around the time when their period would normally come. So there's no ovulation that occurred. They may have bleeding, and sometimes the bleeding looks like a period. But it's not, like it is, but it's not like it's bleeding, but it's not technically a menstrual period. I would say that the definition of a menstrual period is it occurs after, 12 to 14 days after you've actually ovulated. It is possible to have bleeding that is not your period. And you wouldn't necessarily know if you weren't charting. I don't think that is something that happens all the time. I don't think it's something we need to worry about all the time, but it can and does happen. It can be related to stress. And it's really interesting because if you have a situation where you have a delayed ovulation. So let me give the example. Like I said, like a client, let's say she has a bleed on day 30, but she didn't ovulate because we can see in her cycle that there was no signs of ovulation. So, if in times of stress, if she's moving towards ovulation, what's happening hormonally is that, she has this follicular development. So her body's trying to get there. The follicles are growing. The estrogen is being produced. She's seeing some mucus. But for whatever reason, her body's kind of backing off. So in some of these cycles, I've seen mucus patterns, like the mucus comes and then it kind of backs off for a couple of days and it comes again and it backs off for a couple of days. So she's confused. She's expecting ovulation around day 14 because we're all programmed to think that all cycles are 29 days or 28 days with day 14 ovulation. She's not seeing her temperatures are all over the place, but there's no actual rhyme or reason to them. And then, like, behold, on day 30, in my example here, she starts bleeding. And the bleeding is actually significant sometimes. Like, it's actually kind of like a period. And so what's happening in a case like that is that, in a normal healthy cycle, you would have, let's say a normal healthy cycle, average 29 days, you would have approximately as many days of estrogen exposure. So before ovulation, estrogen is the dominant hormone, to the number of days that you would have exposure to progesterone. Because after ovulation, if your luteal phase is healthy, 12 to 14 days, like, you're kind of having an even number of days of each hormone. And progesterone plays an important role in countering some of the effects of estrogen. And one of the things that it does is it matures the lining. It prepares the lining for the fertilized egg. Whereas estrogen, it helps the lining to proliferate and grow. So estrogen is what's really building up the lining. So if you have, instead of having your 14 days of, estrogen exposure, and then you have your 12 to 14 days of progesterone exposure balancing each other, if you just have like 30 days of estrogen exposure, then the lining is kind of building and building and thickening in this example. And eventually, without the progesterone and, to sort it out and to counter it, the lining can become really destabilized, and then you can experience what's called an anovulatory bleed. So yeah.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate these answers because they had come from my community, and I feel like so many women don't know their own bodies or their cycle or what charting is. So what is charting?
Charting. So, charting is just kind of like the casual word for, fertility awareness tracking. So I think, typically when we think of charting, it just means that you're tracking your cycle. So at the most basic sense, there's a lot of period tracker apps out there where you literally just enter your period, and then maybe it predicts when your next one is going to come based on algorithms or something like that. Typically, when we talk about fertility awareness cycle charting, we're looking at more than just the period. We're looking at your cervical mucus data. And we're looking potentially at the basal body temperature. Some charting methods will also look at the cervical position. And with that, you're able to just gather a little bit more information. So not only are you getting the cycle length, but you're able to see and confirm whether ovulation is happening or not, because you're tracking your mucus patterns. And if you are ovulating, like I said, you're going to see the mucus come and then you're going to see it go. If you're tracking your temperature, you're going to see the temperature rise and stay high and then eventually dip when you have your next period. That would be the general what is charting.
And that's where you can learn more about your body and what your body's telling you, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because when we went through the cycle, it is helpful to know what a normal cycle looks like. So, the title of my first book is The Fifth Vital Sign. And I'm making the argument that your menstrual cycle is a vital sign that we should be paying attention to. Just like any of the other vital signs that we're more comfortable with. We're quite familiar with our body temperature, and we're quite familiar with our respiratory rate and, our heart rate and blood pressure and things like that. And so in the same way that if you had elevated blood pressure or too low blood pressure, you're going to go to your, doctor, they're going to test it. They're going to see that it's too high, but it doesn't just tell them, it does tell them that there's something going on, but because the pressure is high, doctors are trained to know what could be causing, this high blood pressure. So they kind of know where to look, and they kind of know what to suggest. And in the same way, if we break the menstrual cycle down into its phases, so it's not just about length, we're looking at the period. What is the quality of the period? How long is it? How much are you bleeding? Do you have pain? if we look at the pre-ovulatory phase, how many days of mucus are you having? Are you ovulating? How long is it? When is ovulation happening in the cycle? And then what are your mucus patterns? If we're looking at the post-ovulatory phase, so after ovulation, how long is it? Are you still seeing mucus? Are you not? Are you seeing bleeding before? Are you having PMS symptoms? So within each of these different aspects of the cycle, there's a lot of information we can gather. I mean, within the charting process, we're checking basal body temperature. And so even that can, let us know if your metabolism is too low, or if something could be going on there. From when we're tracking mucus, it could be something as simple as, could you have an infection, an STI, an underlying bacterial or yeast situation, all the way up to, could you have signs of abnormal cervical cells? And maybe you need to be checked. And then we can look at it on a bigger scale. Like if your cycles are regularly over 35 days, you're only having 8 periods a year, sometimes your cycles are 50 days, then that can tell us something more. That's a characteristic of women with PCOS, and that can be an issue with metabolism, insulin resistance, that kind of thing. And then if you just don't have a period at all, but you're of reproductive age and you haven't had a period for 6 months or a year, then we should be looking at, well, what's going on? Stress, diet-wise? Are you working out too much? And interestingly, if you do fall into the category, let's say, of PCOS with these long irregular cycles, issues with metabolism, issues with insulin resistance, your lifetime risk of diabetes is significantly higher. So interestingly, this abnormal cycle presentation is associated with potentially some significant health outcomes. And in the same way, if you don't ovulate for 3 years, and again, you're a woman of reproductive age, that is associated with an increased lifetime risk of osteoporosis, because your period missing is a sign that something is wrong. So there is this significant connection to health when we look at the cycle, and a healthy cycle is a sign of a healthy body. If the cycle's off, it gives us information when we know where to look.
So you said when it comes to charting or tracking our cycles, we'll chart, look at the mucus and our temperature. But then you also said potentially the location or the position of our cervix. I know we briefly touched on it in the first episode, but what can we do, or how can we look for the position of our cervix?
Well, you simply insert your finger, preferably the middle one, because it's longer for most of us, I think, into the vagina and test it. So with the cervical position, we're looking for a few different things. It's, like I said, it's really fascinating. I remember when I first started charting, that was one of the really interesting aspects of it, because you read about it in the book and then you're just like, wow, it really is different. So when you're in the fertile window, as I said, that's when you are producing estrogen, and estrogen is stimulating the cervix to produce cervical fluid. It is also softening the cervix. So for many women in that fertile window, they'll notice that their cervix feels softer. They'll notice that it's higher in terms of its position in the vagina. And when I say softer, if you touch your nose, that would be an example of a firm cervix. And if you put your lips together and touch your lips, that would be an example of a soft cervix. And, you can maybe feel a bit of a dimple, because the cervix tends to be more open during that fertile window. It doesn't mean open like you could stick your finger in, but it means that it's softer and you typically can feel a bit of an indent versus when you're not in that stage. And then once you've ovulated, the cervix changes position. It goes lower in the vagina. So you don't have to reach as high to find it. And it typically is firmer, going back to the nose. And then that indent kind of opening is no longer there. And I mean, even if you've had children, there may, I've had 3 now vaginally. And so, the cervix does have a bit of an opening. It's always slightly dilated, but you can still tell certainly the firmness and the position of it.
Thank you for that well-rounded answer. I've also heard, Lisa, that there are times in your cycle when you are the most charismatic and flirtatious, and it's also the best time to ask for a raise. What time is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that would probably be ovulation. So I think a lot of women resonate with feeling more energetic, more outgoing, their skin is glowing, maybe they are a lot more interested in their partner during that time. So those would be the days leading up to ovulation, and that would be typically related to your estrogen production. So that's something to consider. And there's a lot of interesting research as well, because when I was writing the fifth vital sign, I was looking at birth control research and, part of I'll tie this in, but part of the reason is because, when women are on the birth control pill, there's all this research that has been done that's suggesting that, men may be responding to them differently, or they may be choosing different men because their natural kind of hormone pheromone situation is disrupted by that. So there are these studies where where they'll kind of have, I don't know exactly how they do this, but there's studies that would indicate that, men are more receptive, obviously, to their partners and that kind of thing. But even they like the sound of your voice better when you're in the ovulation phase. And there was one study, I think it's the funniest study. Every time I talk about it, you always get an interesting reaction. It's called the stripper study. So if anyone hasn't heard of that, you can look it up. It is real. I mean, I always want to know, like, when I'm reading these studies, I'm like, how did this come about? Like, right? Because it's not like it was like they were at a party and he said it and then it just never happened. It literally did happen. So how did they organize this? Anyway, so in the stripper study, they quite literally had, it was like a nightclub, and they had a group of women. So they had their control group and the test group, but they had a group of women on the pill. They had a group of women who weren't on the pill. They were all strippers. They, had them track their cycles in whatever way that they did for the study. And they measured their tips throughout the cycle to see if there was any difference. And it turned out that the women who, yes, this is real, the women who were not on the pill, they earned, if I remember correctly, on average, $83 more per night, if I remember correctly. I don't have the study in front of me. And so when they looked at it throughout the cycle, during the menstrual phase, they didn't make as much money. During the ovulation phase, they had this huge jump. And the women who were on the pill, it was the same all the time. So they didn't really have any change. And so, I mean, there's that.
Well, that's new to me. Thank you for sharing the stripper study. Very fascinating. But I have heard on other podcasts before what you had mentioned, that when you're on birth control, you're taking away these natural, I don't know, rhythms of being a female. And I've heard that the biggest time in a woman's life when she considers divorce is when she gets off the birth control pill to have children, because then there can be a fluctuation between being attracted to your partner.
Well, so, and that piece of information is obviously very controversial. And depending on who you're talking to, people get really upset about this. It's like, I'm more than my hormones. I chose my husband for, right? And it's scary. It's scary. But basically, you have these studies, and they're in this field of evolutionary biology, So they're looking at all of these different traits that are to do with mating. And it really is fascinating. And so, they're looking at this idea of compatibility and genetic compatibility. And, the theory is that if you are naturally pheromoned, so you're not hormone birth controlled, then when you go out into the wild, you're naturally going to be attracted to a partner who is more genetically diverse than you. So when you look at when they do their magical calculations with all of the gene research, they're identifying that you are more genetically dissimilar, and that is associated with better outcomes according to these studies. And what they find is that when women are on birth control, they are choosing partners that are more genetically similar to themselves. And so they're exploring if this could have an impact on the compatibility, on it's even reading it feels very controversial, because they're kind of suggesting, could there be, if there's less genetic compatibility, could there be issues with the reproduction, that kind of thing. But yeah, so one of the things that, and I have an actual story from a woman in the fifth vital sign, because in this chapter I included these snippets of actual what women were actually saying. I someone who I interviewed on the podcast. And so there are reports of women. So you meet a guy, you're on the pill, you think he's great, you come off the pill, and all of a sudden you detect the scent that you never smelled before. And all of a sudden you're kind of not interested anymore. Now, again, obviously this isn't everybody's experience, but don't get mad at me. It's what the research says. And
yes.
this does happen to people, you
Yes.
know, and I don't know if like, I don't know about the study about the divorce thing, but like, you know, now you have the heads up, right? If you're dating someone and you're like, I think he might be the one, come off the pill. Like, I'm not like, don't be
Yeah.
like in, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, be responsible.
Yes.
So, you know, find another alternative if you're not trying to get pregnant, but you know, just heads up.
It's a really good segue into, I've had a handful of friends who were using an app that had the capability to track, I'll say ovulation, but it was mostly a period tracker. You put your temperature in every day. Many of them have accidentally gotten pregnant because they didn't want to be on the birth control pill anymore. So, Lisa, I guess I don't know what question I want to ask you, but can you give us some examples, some stories of why it's not just an app that we should be putting all our faith in?
Well, so it's interesting because as a fertility awareness educator, you know, I've been in the field for over 20 years. So I was like doing this back in 2000 before there were apps. So one of the things that I don't want to speak to on behalf of like all fertility awareness educators, but like one of the things that you like, especially before, I think it's different now. There's a lot more awareness around fertility awareness now, but back in the day, there was a lot more skepticism. There's still a lot of skepticism, but there was a lot more. And so, you know, the questions that I was being asked back then, the first question out of everyone's mouth was like, is this just like the rhythm method? And so then we were trying to distinguish ourselves from that, you know, and the rhythm method is essentially based on calendar calculation. So you're looking at your history of cycling and you're calculating kind of like an average. And out of that average, you're determining a fertile window. And then you're but you're not basing it on like real-time data that's happening today. You're basing it on this like probability due, you know, based on the calculation and all that kind of stuff. So with modern fertility awareness-based methods, they are not based on retrospective calculations, you know, to determine the fertile window. There are methods. So I do teach the, you know, double check, a version of the double check symptothermal method where we do use a calculation to give you a pre-ovulatory last infertile day calculation, meaning we give you a cutoff date. But that aside, we are looking at real-time data. So we just spent a lot of time talking about cervical fluid. And so, you know, cervical fluid is important because it is a sign of fertility. Sperm can survive in cervical fluid for up to 5 days. And so when you're in that window, when you're making cervical fluid, your cervix is softer, it's in that higher position. That's the time when pregnancy is actually possible. And because sperm can survive for up to 5 days in your cervical fluid, and you can't actually predict exactly when ovulation is going to happen, the method itself is based on identifying whether you are on a fertile day or an infertile day, right? And it's like based on what you saw today. So my argument with the apps is that, you know, I don't care how many millions or hundreds of dollars went into the algorithm. The app doesn't know what's in your panties today. It just doesn't know. You know, if it does, you should be concerned, and maybe you should talk to the person who made the app. Like, I don't know what's going on. But yeah, so there's that. You know, what you're doing is like the rhythm method, and you're trusting this device and the people who made the device. I'm gonna just go out on a limb and say they didn't study fertility awareness-based methods. You know, especially if it's just a period tracker app. So essentially, you're just not using a method. So I think that one of the big misconceptions, or like the big kind of like hurdles that especially for women who want to chart their cycles, we have to face is the idea that these methods don't work, they're not effective. But at the same time, are we really defining what fertility awareness methods are? So we can use the words fertility awareness method, we can use the words charting. And a lot of people think that, you know, there's this one fertility awareness method that we all agree on. And when we say fertility awareness, that we're all talking about the same thing. But if we look at what the research has to say, there are multiple different fertility awareness based methods that are tracking the signs that I've been talking about in different ways. So there are mucus only methods that look at mucus as the main sign, that don't track temperature. There are symptothermal methods, like the method I teach, which does look at mucus and temperature. And I mentioned the last infertile day calculation and also cervical position. There are symptom hormonal methods that would look at the ovulation strips and potentially even do testing to determine estrogen or progesterone levels as a way to kind of really figure out what's going on. And then there are modern day rhythm methods. So there are modern day calendar methods that actually have research behind them and things like that. So there are multiple ways to do this. So, what I would say is I want women to be successful. Fertility awareness-based methods offer an incredible option for women, especially women who have had a negative experience on birth control. At the end of the day, what the research tells us is that up to 50% of women either come off their birth control or switch their birth control within the first year of using it. So a lot of us are not happy. Some of us are happy. So if you're happy, hey girl. But not all of us are happy. Okay. We're not. And I've sat in rooms with women who've tried. They've tried this method. They had panic attacks. They got another one. They felt depressed. They had another one. They had no libido. They finally went with the IUD and the insertion pain was out of this world. And then they still have side effects of the IUD because it's hormonal or whatever. So there's some women that are really sensitive to the stuff. They don't do well on it. And I can't tell you, I used to run these group classes. So I'd be in a room, in a Zoom room, but I'd be in this class with 8 women, 10 women, 15 women, and they would all be sharing their stories. And I heard it so many times, like I went on this one, I went on this one, I tried. And finally I was just like, I need birth control and I just feel like I have no options. And I'm just like, oh, I'm going to have to go back on this other thing, even though I know it's going to give me these side effects. And then in a desperate night of Googling, I discovered fertility awareness, right? It shouldn't have to be a desperate night of Googling. So fertility awareness-based methods do offer a great alternative for women who have had negative experiences on birth control and are looking for an alternative. And I always say no one has ever forced anybody to use fertility awareness. So women self-select to this method. If you're listening to this and you're intrigued by it, welcome. It's not like everyone wants to do this, and that's fine. So I'm not saying everybody has to, right? But it's like, so for me, I'm really passionate, obviously, about educating and sharing this information, but having women be successful. So if you're wanting to use this method and you're wanting to be successful, then a period tracker app is not enough. Even those, I would say, and I'm sure there's people who disagree with me. I would say that even the fertility awareness apps that say they have research behind them, I would say that's not enough either. If you really want to use this method and you're really wanting to avoid pregnancy, I think that it's worth investing in working with an instructor. There's a lot of benefits of working with an instructor. One is that it really speeds the time that it takes for you to get comfortable and confident, because you have, especially a certified instructor in a specific method. So do a little bit of research, determine which method you feel most comfortable with, work with an instructor, because a lot of things happen when you chart. You're not a robot. So you're going to see different mucus patterns. You're going to see delayed ovulation. And if you're not prepared for that, that's when unplanned pregnancies happen, because you're making assumptions and you're not really trained to go based on the data just yet. It takes a little bit of time for us to break out of our rhythm of thinking. Remember the day 21 progesterone testing? We're all waiting for ovulation on day 14, but no, we're not robots. So there's a window of time. And if you're going into it without any experience and just kind of having sex before you fully gain that confidence, then you do have a greater risk. But it's not because the method itself is risky. It's because you don't know what you're doing.
Yes. I think that's a really good example. All these stories, I feel like it all comes back to charting and knowing your body. And that's where you get to take the power back.
Yes. But I would say that it's so, controversial take. Like, yes, we want to know our body, but fertility awareness is not like you get to know your body. But the myth is that you know your body so well you don't even have to chart anymore. You just wake up and you're just like, I know. No, you don't. Okay. If you didn't track what's going on, if you didn't check for mucus today, if you didn't take your temperature, if you're not putting anything on a piece of paper, if you're keeping it in your brain, no, you actually don't know, right? Because I can't even remember what I had for breakfast last week. So are you telling me that you can remember when you had mucus? No, you can't, right? So it is a method, and it can be highly effective. So for example, the fertility awareness-based method with the highest consistent efficacy would be the double check symptothermal method, like I said, with the last infertile date calculation. So studies on that particular way of doing this show up to a 99.6% efficacy with perfect use, and up to a 98% effectiveness with typical use. All fertility awareness-based methods do not have as high of an efficacy number, though. With that said, there are other methods like the mucus only methods, or even symptothermal methods that have a decent efficacy, but not necessarily at the 98%, right? But with that said, if you take the time to learn a specific method with a certified instructor, and you take the time to understand the rules, and you understand that it's going to take a few cycles for you to chart and learn before you actually start having unprotected sex, then you can be very successful. And for the DIYers out there, yes, I know you are out there, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are women out there who are successful without instructors. But if that's the route you're going to take, then you have to take the responsibility of really choosing a specific method, learning that method, and taking sufficient time. So I would recommend 3 to 6 cycles of charting before you have unprotected sex at all, so that you can really get comfortable with what's going on. That's enough time for you to start to see some cycle changes and fluctuations that you might not have expected, and to really get a grasp on the rules before you start having unprotected sex.
What's your preferred way of tracking? Can I use an Excel spreadsheet, a regular notebook?
My preferred way is whatever you're going to actually do. Like whatever's going to work. When I started charting, it was legit an Excel spreadsheet, because it was like before the apps and all that. And I made these books. I went to the Staples and bound them, and you don't necessarily I actually have a workbook for sale. It's behind me there, the Fertility Awareness Charting Workbook, because there are still a small number of women who love charting on paper, and I like charting on paper too. But obviously there's lots of different apps. My general recommendation for, and the majority of my clients do use apps. I mean, the reason I made the book is, I kind of thought that everyone was over the paper now, right? Because of the apps. So, but then consistently about 15% of my clients would still use paper. So I was like, okay, we've got our diehards here, but the majority do use apps. And so my general recommendations for apps are, if you're really charting your cycle, wanting to use fertility awareness, choose an app that allows you to turn off the predictor setting, and consider turning it off. I mean, I wouldn't really recommend turning on anything that's predicting when you're ovulating or when your period is coming until you actually have enough charting experience that you are good. Because what happens is, if you're just starting, then you start to doubt yourself. I mean, come on, it's saying that you're going to ovulate. You're kind of looking at it. You still aren't confident. So I find that kind of stuff causes a lot of confusion. So I think have the option to turn off the predictor setting. If you're wanting to track mucus, look for beyond a period tracker app, but look for something that allows you to track mucus as well. And it's wild, because when I first started the podcast, there was one app. Or maybe there was like 2 or 3, but there was definitely not like thousands like there are now. Mm-hmm. It's just incredible to see how everything has shifted.
I'm curious to learn about women in perimenopause, where their periods are getting longer or shorter. What kind of tips do you have for women in perimenopause?
I mean, in terms of cycle length, it's interesting to look at the research that has been done. And interestingly, I was talking about this with our practitioners in the call that I had just before this one. We were talking about cycle lengths and how they vary in perimenopause. So there's a really interesting study that I often refer to that was done in 1967. So it's like a really old study. So I know someone's thinking like, oh man, that's like not good data. But that study that was done in 1967, what makes it unique is that the study population, it was before 1960. And 1960 is when the pill first came on the market. So we're legit getting insight into what I call virgin cycles, right? So we're kind of seeing a window into what's going on. So in that particular study, they had over 2,000 participants, almost 3,000 participants, and they collected data from over 250,000 menstrual cycles. And they kind of plotted it all out. And the study is like 50 pages long. They have all these different graphs, and it's really, really interesting. And so what they did is they kind of showed you the variation in cycle length across a woman's reproductive life, from menarche to menopause. And so during the 10 years before menopause, which is the word for your last period, during that 10-year period, what we see is we do see the cycles changing as women are kind of drawing near to that 10 years before menopause. And I would say, if you think of the pre-menopause years, this 10 years before the last period, the first 5 to 6 of those years, we tend to see the cycle shortening a bit. So while the average menstrual cycle for, like on average for a woman of reproductive age, any study you look at, the average length is about 29 days consistently. And but if we look at that 10-year period, the average length can be a bit shorter, more like 26 days. So we do tend to see that the ovulation starts happening earlier in the cycle. Cycle length tends to shift. Charting allows you to know if it's the ovulation that's earlier or if it's the luteal phase that's shorter or both, because you wouldn't know if you weren't charting. You wouldn't know how long the luteal phase is or when ovulation is happening. So you would be just kind of guessing and speculating as to what's going on there. Because it is possible to have like a healthier, shorter cycle. Maybe your luteal phase is great, but the ovulation just was happening earlier, right? So that information can be helpful. But then what we tend to see during the 2 to 4 years before a woman's last period, and the average age for menopause is about 51, we tend to see that the cycles start to lengthen and there's more cycle irregularity. And then especially in those last 2 years when you kind of, women who've been through it, if anyone's listening who's kind of been through that or is in that right now, you start to get to the point where it's like, is this the last cycle? When was the last time I had my period? And then eventually your period stop. And the definition of menopause is when it's been a full year since your last one.
Thank you for explaining that, because I know I have a lot of listeners in perimenopause who are fluctuating. Speaking of fluctuating, sometimes before my period, my boobs get so sore where I can't even have my husband hug me. I'm like, oh no. But then some cycles, I'm completely fine. So tell me, why would someone get sore breasts?
I think there's a few different reasons. I mean, what we do know about the post-ovulatory phase is that, you have significant progesterone. And when we think about, most of us, if not all of us, have kind of seen those hormone charts, right? Where you see the line with the estrogen, it's like a little mountain, and then ovulation, and then you see like the progesterone mountain, and they're the same size. So if we were to actually put progesterone and estrogen in the same measurements, the progesterone would be like to the ceiling because we produce significantly more. So part of that could be related to, hormone shifts, and we would want to look at how healthy the luteal phase is, and if you're producing enough progesterone, how you're metabolizing those hormones. In some cases, it could be related to nutrient deficiencies. So, for example, iodine deficiency is associated with breast tenderness and even the formation of lumps and cysts in the breasts. So, for some women, sorting that out can improve it, and for others, maybe doing some hormone supportive strategies can help as well.
What other kind of symptoms would someone experience in PMS, and how could they regulate them?
With PMS, there's a researcher that I'm thinking of. I believe his name is Guy Abraham, and he divided PMS into 4 categories. So he talked about anxiety. He talked about hyperhydration, which is bloating, which is super fun. Depression. So there's obviously there's a lot of different things that can happen emotionally, and cravings, carb cravings. That was the other one. And so, one thing that's interesting about PMS symptoms is that women who have moderate to severe PMS are more likely to have low progesterone or less than optimal progesterone. Or if you look at their cycle, maybe their luteal phase is really short, which would indicate that the progesterone is dropping too soon. Because again, the healthy luteal phase should be 12 to 14 days. So if your luteal phase is 9 days, you're missing out on at least 3 days of progesterone, which would mean that you're not getting as much as you would if you had a normal length luteal phase, right? So with those, there's those, that's kind of like a general overview of the categories. But I think for anyone who's experienced it, it can, you can get irritated. This all like maybe the sound of your husband's voice was great around ovulation, but now you're just like, don't talk to me, right? So yeah, a lot of different things can happen, like teariness and those types of things. So there in the 5th vital sign, I have a whole chapter on PMS, and I kind of explore this concept a little bit more, because what the research tells us is that 90% of women report that they experience some PMS symptoms. 90%. Like if I told you that 90% of women were tired after a run, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, would we, so what I kind of explored in that chapter, there's this older medical term called menstrual molamina. And the idea behind that is that there potentially, like, there's an argument for a shift and change in energy as we go through our cycle. So just like we talked about how, a lot of women report feeling energized and great and, glowing skin and more sexually interested, if you will, around ovulation. A lot of women report that they feel less outgoing and maybe they want to chill and relax. Maybe they feel a little bit differently. I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm saying that they just have a change in their energy. And two of my favorite women, Alexandra and Sjanie Hugo Wurlitzer, they wrote a book called Wild Power, and they talk about this concept of the menstrual cycle as the seasons. So they use this analogy of going through the seasons of the year. And so your period would be the inner winter, and then the follicular phase would represent the inner spring. And if you think about it, your ovaries are working to develop these follicles in the same way that the tree might be working on those little sprouts, right? And so that's interesting. And then ovulation would represent the inner summer. And that corresponds for a lot of women, like, it makes so much sense. Like, okay, I'm feeling so creative. I'm feeling so energized around ovulation and all of that. And then after ovulation, you move into the fall. We all are very familiar with the fall. And then your menstruation would be the winter. So I think there is an argument for like PMS. Like, so I would say mild symptoms that are like, I don't want to use the word symptoms, mild mood changes, emotional shifts. There's an argument that is actually just a normal part of being a woman and going through these cycles.
Oh,
and
great.
I would say, though, there's a distinction. So I would say moderate to severe symptoms, though, outside of, like, I'm talking about, like, it's not destroying your day. You're not trying to like scream down your partner. Like, I'm just, but you notice a change in your energy and you recognize, as someone who's been cycling and tracking for decades, you notice a shift. And I'm saying that with, like, when you're not having these serious symptoms, like that has to be normal. 90% of anybody who, right? Like, so that's what I'm saying. But there is a line. That's what we have to talk about, like the line. So there's a line between having these energy shifts and like recognizing your changes in energy and mood and things like that, to actually having, fits where you're bawling, where you're crying, when you are feeling depressed, when you're feeling anxious, when you have out of control cravings, when you have days of spotting. So there's obviously a difference between what they termed the menstrual molamina and your actual, like, moderate to severe PMS symptoms. And what the research tells us is that women, like I said, the progesterone is a lot lower. So interestingly, you can do a lot to support PMS by learning a little bit about how to support hormone production, looking at your dietary practices, just listening to your body. Like, if I just explained to you this whole thing with the spring and the fall and the winter, and you want to take like the day before your period and run like a marathon, like, good for you. Like, again, girl, you do your thing. But there comes a point, I think, where if we want to really understand our bodies and work within that structure, then it makes a lot of sense to start. It doesn't mean we're bound to it. It doesn't mean you have to do it. Like, I schedule my things based on when they're at. So yeah, sometimes I'm doing a podcast interview on day one of my period. That is not today, but I'm just saying. So I'm not saying it has to be like that. I'm not saying it has to be rigid, but there's a whole, now it's interesting for me to see, but there is a whole trend of cycle syncing, right? ARAZA Beauty, Woman Code, right? There's a whole trend of this. And there's women now who teach about how to, exercise around your cycle and how to eat around your cycle. And there's all these people. So I'm not saying we have to take it like that far, but if all you take from this part of the conversation is that you're actually not a man, okay? You're not on a 24-hour circadian rhythm situation. You're on a monthly situation. And if you can't like organize, like, you have permission to not do like a 40-day workout challenge and work out the same every day. Like, you have permission to chill when you're in the luteal phase a little bit, when you're actively bleeding from your vagina. Like, you can actually take a break. And maybe by resting a little bit more during that time, maybe by nourishing your body a little bit more, maybe by paying attention and actually leading into that a little bit more on a few days if you need it, then you can make up for it. Because when you're in your luteal, like, you have this, like, or when you're in your ovulation phase, for a lot of women, I'm just going to say every woman on earth doesn't necessarily feel the best during her ovulation. Some women have issues with histamines, and the high estrogen doesn't help that. And so, if that's happening, there may be something for you to look into. But a lot of women will say they have a lot of energy. And yeah, maybe you can work out and organize your workouts on a monthly basis and do lighter activities in the luteal to preserve your progesterone as well, and your mind. And then do some of the heavier activities when you're not in that stage, when you have more energy and you have more, in your tank to spare. So there is certainly, it's a lot to think about. But it's funny because after I said all of that, everyone who's listening is like, well, that makes perfect sense. It's so obvious after, right? Someone points it out.
I like what you're saying, though. And I like the idea of our cycle being in sync with seasons. That really resonates with me. Now I feel like I have to get that book.
Yeah, it's a great book. And I also talk about that. Like, I cite them, I interviewed them, and I have some excerpts from the interview. So in one of the chapters of the Fifth Vital Sign, I go through that whole concept as well.
Amazing. Okay. Well, we will put some links in the show notes to point people in that direction. I have a 2-part question for you, Lisa. What is one thing that most women do when it comes to fertility awareness that you think is crazy?
Crazy. That's a strong word.
Well, maybe a little wild, maybe unorthodox, or like, why would you do that?
I mean, so I've been teaching for so long, so I feel like I've seen it all. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it's crazy, but I would say the one thing that comes to mind is what I call rhythm method thinking. So like I said, my biggest thing is I want to set up women for success. I want women to know that this method really can work if you learn how to use it and you learn the rules and you follow them. It's not this whole idea that it's just too complicated or it takes too much time, or, I just feel like that's condescending. Like I said, women self-select to this method. So no one's ever forced anyone to chart their cycles. And if you feel called to do it, you can do it. You just have to take the time to learn, right? So the one thing I would say isn't great is that rhythm method thinking. When we really want, it's like, I was talking about this before. It's like, I'm so connected to my body. Like, right? Like that I don't even have to check my mucus because I just know, like, no, you don't. So that would be the thing when you see like a little bit of mucus, but it's like, oh, but I never ovulate this early. And then you have sex. Or even if you're trying to get pregnant and you see mucus really early and you're like, well, I never ovulate this early. So I'm just going to ignore what's literally coming out of my vagina right now. And I'm going to go based on my thought, which is that I ovulate on day 14 and miss my window and then have another cycle that I didn't get pregnant in, right? So I would say that that's the thing. I would say women who are, they're really excited and thrilled about using the method, but they're not really using the method. They're actually kind of using the rhythm method because they haven't yet had the experience to let their cycle lead their decisions as opposed to what they think should be happening.
Okay. I like that. I like that you're sharing the insights of it's really important to know what's going on with your body. Now, what's one wild or crazy thing that you do that other people might think is quite bizarre?
I'm sure there's quite a few. So I'll list a few for fun. So I don't think anyone would, well, maybe someone will probably think this is weird. So I've been getting raw milk for my family for 10 years. Raw, unpasteurized milk from a cow. We should all be dead, but we're not. So there's one.
I feel like I'm always being watched when I buy raw milk. I'm like, am I going to be arrested? It's not legal in this state.
It's not legal in Canada either. Hey, but I can go to the store and buy all the pot. I don't smoke marijuana, but I'm just saying that if I did, I can go and get it. But milk, man, that's dangerous. Those people with their milk. They should be arrested. So there's that. And I do eat a lot of organ meats and stuff like that. So I will put a cow tongue in my Instant Pot and I will peel it and cut it and eat it, and it's delicious. I will use chicken feet in my broth. And I'll tell you a funny story. So when my eldest son was younger, because I used to just buy the chicken feet and just put them in for the gelatin, and it's delicious. Just in case. Like, I'm not saying in this part of the example, I was not eating the chicken feet. I was putting them in the broth, and the broth was delicious. But then my eldest son, when he was younger, I don't remember exactly how old, he was like, I want to try it. I want to try the chicken foot. And I was like, okay, but like, I can't let my child try something that I wouldn't try. This is just me. I know everyone's not like that, maybe, but I'm like, if you're going to eat it, I have to eat it, because like, I can't do this to you. So then we tried the chicken feet. Now we eat chicken feet.
What does it taste
enjoy
like?
The broth. It tastes like chicken, but it does. It tastes like chicken. But for people who are really squeamish around texture of food, probably not going to love it. But I'm not. I'm open. Okay. I'm open-minded. The only thing, oh my gosh. So I was in Mexico City last week, and I don't want to offend it. I'm not trying to offend, but I'm just going to objectively say. So I was in the airport, and there were literal grasshoppers in a bag as snacks for sale. So I will not eat bugs, but I will eat chicken feet and cow tongue and heart and liver and bone marrow.
I love that. I love bone marrow. I've heard that bone marrow makes like the best baby food.
Yeah, it's great. I've done that for my children. They've eaten bone marrow, and it comes with its own container. Just to scoop it out.
Yes. I feel like I would eat bugs if they weren't living. Like if they were ground up in some kind of bar.
Never. I can't. That's the one thing. No. I probably have, because they probably hide in the food already, but I'm not. No, hard pass.
Well, sorry. If you eat peanut butter, you're already eating bugs.
Well, I understand I'm sure like there's probably been a bug in my salad before, but that was against my will. That's not the same.
Okay.
Right? That was under duress.
Oh, I feel like we're so aligned. This is so much fun. Lisa, do you have any upcoming programs, or what can people do if they want to work with you?
Thank you for asking. I mean, at this point in my career, I have started to focus on practitioner programs because I've been in the field for a very long time. And my dream is for all women to understand how their cycles work. And I started by working woman to woman in group programs, and now I feel like the impact that I can have by supporting women to take this process and teach their clients to chart, but not only that, to use the cycle as a vital sign. So we've created the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Certification Program for women's health professionals specifically, and we run the program a few times a year. The next round starts in January of 2026. So if anyone wants to learn more, there's lots of different ways to do that. We actually have a couple different opt-ins or a couple different, I'll say that again. I would say the word opt-in. Sorry. But we do have a couple different we have a couple different gifts. So we created this ebook called How to Interpret Virtually Any Chart Your Client Throws at You. And when we created it, we are essentially sharing our step-by-step process for how we teach chart interpretation. And ultimately in the program, that's what we do. We teach our practitioners how to interpret any chart, even if it's complex, even if it doesn't look like the textbook. And so, you get that wonderful introduction to how to do that. So fertilityfriday.com/chart. And then for more information about the program, you can go to my website, fertilityfriday.com.
Amazing. That's really cool that you're now gearing your practice towards working with practitioners, because then I feel like that's a wider scope of people that you get to help, that get to learn about their bodies.
It's been a really interesting journey because I discovered charting. I graduated high school in the year 2000, and I was in university at the end of that year, and it was right around my first year of university that I started charting. So, and then I was doing I ended up connecting with a group of women who were teaching charting at my university campus at a very young age, and we were teaching women in coffee shops back in the day. And so back then, there was no one talking about it. It's so interesting. When I started my podcast in 2014, there was zero other fertility awareness podcast. So it's been just amazing to see the shift. What I always say is I don't think we've hit critical mass. I don't think we're really at that point that we, the average woman still doesn't know about her cycle, and most women haven't really heard about charting. A lot of women have, but most women haven't. But there's so many more educators. There's so many more women talking about it. There's so many period podcasts. There's so many period hormone coaches, and that wasn't a thing before. And so what I see is that there is a need now. Women are starting to learn more about charting, and there's a need for practitioners to have the skill of chart interpretation. And it is a whole situation. The fertility awareness charting piece is a whole field in and of itself, and there's a lot to learn. And the charting aspect of it, we've talked a lot about it, but it offers this personalized tool. So when you were talking about your sore breasts, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I want to see your whole intake form, and I want to see your whole chart, and I want to see how long your luteal phase is, and I want to see all, there's so much more that we can do with all of this information to be able to support our clients when we have it. And that's essentially where, so, now I've seen so much happen in the last 20 years. What's going to happen in the next 20? And I think training practitioners, that has the potential to really just totally disrupt a lot of things. And that's what I want to see.
Yes, I love that. Lisa, I feel like I could talk to you for hours. It is such a delight always to have you on the show. But as we wrap up this podcast, I ask all my guests the same closing question, which is, what haven't I asked you that you'd like my listeners to know?
Oh, that's a good one. I feel like you asked such great questions. You didn't ask me what I had for breakfast.
Okay, now I'm very interested. What did you have for
I'm
breakfast?
Sorry. I just knew that was not the answer you were looking for. That's hilarious. I actually had some rainbow trout. It was good. It was like leftover from last night.
Gross. Fish for breakfast? Like,
yeah.
Good for you.
What do you mean gross? It was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Really healthy is what I meant. Good for you. Really healthy. Well, maybe one thing that we didn't talk about, but you can take this anywhere, is that I have friends with teenagers, and I know that their teenagers are interested in sex and they don't really know what to do. And I told one of my friends to use an app. I was like, make sure she uses this app so she can start learning about her body. And she goes, my daughter isn't going to take her temperature every morning. She goes, there needs to be something else. She's like, the pill's easy. I don't know what to do. And I was like, I know there's people who know what to do.
At the end of the day, like it's a tough question, because you have, the parents' preference, you have the teen's preference, you have the partner preference, and all the things. So a couple thoughts. I mean, I do think it's important for all women to understand how their bodies work. I think it's important for all women to even understand, how to identify ovulation, even if it's just by tracking mucus. But I think that it is possible to teach teenage girls how to chart their cycles and have it not be automatically their default birth control method. So I do think that that's interesting, because whenever I get asked that question in one way or another, it's kind of like, so what do you think about the teens? Like, should they be like, right? It's kind of like the eyebrows are up, right? And I think that like I get it, and I can anticipate the blowback, but I do think that condoms are a good idea for teenagers if they are sexually active, because condoms also prevent STIs. So regardless of what other choices are being made, I think that's my opinion. I think condoms are, I get it. You can't ensure that that's going to happen, but I do think it's worthwhile to have conversations and talk about, just like to have open conversations with your children, and, encourage the level of responsibility and all of that. So in terms of the charting piece of it, I do think that it is helpful to teach, even just if I were to teach one thing to every teenage girl, it would be about her mucus, because she doesn't have to take her temperature to understand when she's ovulating and what that means. And we just talked about the seasons of the menstrual cycle. Teach her about that. Teach her about how her cycle, her energy may fluctuate throughout her cycle. Prepare her, teach her what a healthy cycle looks like. And if you teach her about a cervical mucus, then even if that's all she paid attention to, when she sees the slippery stuff, because when I was a teenager, I didn't know what that stuff was. I remember I asked my mom and she gave me panty liners, and that was the conversation because she didn't know either.
Oh.
So, if you teach about the mucus, then you teach that it's associated with fertility, and you teach that it means that, especially if she's menstruating now, it means that you're ovulating, your body's releasing an egg. I think that this is all very fascinating information. I have not met a woman who was not fascinated by this and who wasn't thrilled to learn about it, right? Teach her something positive about her body so that she learns and she can appreciate what's going on. And, again, what a healthy cycle looks like. And what even the conversation we had about PMS and how there's a normal level of change in energy versus what's abnormal. Because one of the issues I have is that we're teaching girls that it's normal to have pain and it's normal to have PMS and it's that time of the month and it's Shark Week and all this kind of stuff. And so they're assuming that all of those negative symptoms are how it's supposed to be. So they're suffering and they don't even realize that that's not optimal. They think that that's optimal. So cool fun fact, if you teach your daughters about mucus and you teach them to identify when they have it and when it stops, they can then predict their periods with a fair degree of certainty, because once the mucus dries up, then your period is probably going to show up about 12 to 14 days later, or maybe a little bit earlier if you have a short luteal phase. Who doesn't want to know? A lot of girls go on the pill just because they're afraid that they're going to have their period. It's going to surprise them. So it's a lot of that's really, really important. And then while I don't I shared my opinion about condoms, beyond that, I mean, that's a decision. One of the things as well for so many women who I've worked with over the years and who've learned about, the side effects of related to the pill and that kind of thing, it can be horrifying when your daughter or niece or, whoever decides that she wants to go on the pill because, So I would say that have a honest conversation, learn about the side effects of birth control. Don't have it be that your daughter goes on the pill and you never talked about it. Go through the side effects. So, not to plug my books, but I will talk about the books. In the Fifth Vital Sign, I have an entire chapter on birth control and it goes through the side effects. And it's not my opinion. I share research. There's 200 citations in that chapter alone. And so going through the common side effects, because what happens for young women is that no one tells them about the side effects. And so then when they are, and they're teenagers too. So how do you know if she's freaking out because she's going through her normal hormonal development, or if she's depressed and upset because of the pill? Well, you won't know anything if you didn't even talk about it. So, educate her on the side effects, let her know, not to scare her, but just to tell her, understand the more severe ones. If she develops migraines with aura, that was the only time in my life where I had migraines with aura. You shouldn't be on an estrogen containing birth control pill, if you have migraines with aura. Okay. Especially if you're having them while you're on it, you may be at a higher risk for a stroke. And there was a study that I shared years ago, and they estimated that somewhere between 250 to 300 women in the United States die every year from using the pill as directed. And they said in the study that's the equivalent to a jumbo jet crashing every year. So while it's a very small percentage of women who actually die from birth control, there is a percentage who do. And I was featured in the Business of Birth Control documentary with Ricky Lake and Abby Epstein released that documentary a few years ago during the COVID. They released it. And, they featured a family who lost their young daughter, due to birth control. And so, again, this is an important conversation. And I think I'm not saying these things to scare anybody or whatever, but, you can't die if you eat chicken. So if you're putting your child on a medication and one of the side effects of that medication is death, you should actually be talking to her about those things so that, she's a teenager, she's going to be an adult. This is a big responsibility. So you should be able to have that conversation. If she's, if she wants to go on the pill and if she wants to have sex, those are adult decisions. So let's have that adult conversation about the side effects so that if she actually did experience something, A, you did talk to her about it so she knows she can talk to you. And B, she's not gaslit to think that it's normal to feel, all kinds of crazy anxiety, panic attacks, depression, low libido, painful sex. She needs to know that it could be a side effect associated with her birth control.
Wow. I feel like I have learned so much. I love that I'm still thinking about days 19 to 20 and when to test, because now I feel like I have much better advice to give. The stats about birth control are amazing. The seasons of the cycle, there are so many things. Lisa, it's been so lovely chatting with you. I know you mentioned it earlier, but please tell my listeners where they can go to find you.
Well, so there's a few places. I mean, if you enjoyed today's conversation, as I mentioned, I've been podcasting since 2014. We're almost at episode 600, which is absolutely wild. So if you search Fertility Friday on your favorite podcast player, I am the pink one, because yes, now there is another company out there who call themselves Fertility Friday Certified Podcast, but mine is the pink one. So you'll find me. And you can find me on Instagram at Fertility Friday. Like I said, my website, fertilityfriday.com. There's information there about our practitioner training programs. For anybody who is wanting support with personal charting, I do have an online course for personal charting. And of course, I've mentioned my book. So my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, let me think. It's almost been 7 years since I released that book. In 2026 will be year 7, which is wild. And most recently, I worked with Lily Nichols. We co-authored Real Food for Fertility. And so, that book was intended for anyone who is planning to conceive, actively trying to conceive, and it goes way beyond the food conversation. So there's such solid nutritional advice. Lily is absolutely amazing. But we also get into the fertility awareness method, optimizing your chances of conception with fertility awareness-based methods. We have a whole chapter on, birth control, and, even going through some of the non-hormonal method options. I know I mentioned condoms, but there are other non-hormonal options as well. Sperm quality, egg quality, you name it. So there's a lot of resources. So if you go to realfoodforfertility.com, you can grab the first chapter free. Both books are available on Amazon in audio for those of you. I mean, I read most of my books audio, like 3 Kids, Business. I would love to sit down and read a book, but I'm usually listening on the go. So I get it.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was such a pleasure. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening today. If you have the time, a review would genuinely mean the world to me. You could also do a quick shout out on Instagram. I'm at Ashley_Deely, or Welcome to Wellness Podcast. Your voice matters. This podcast is presented for educational and exploratory purposes only. The published content is not intended to be used for diagnosing or treating any illnesses, disease, or disorders. Those responsible for this show disclaim any responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of this information presented by myself or my guests. Please consult with your healthcare provider before using any products or services referenced in this podcast. The content here is for informational purposes only. Episodes on the Welcome to Wellness podcast may at times cover sensitive topics, including, but not limited to, depression, suicide, 5G, nootropics, circumcisions, birth control, the Women's Health Initiative, the use of plant medicine, abortion, geoengineering, terrorism, gender, AI, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You are advised to refrain from listening to this podcast if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. However, if these topics interest you just may have found your tribe. The information or opinions expressed on the Welcome to Wellness show are solely the views of the individuals involved and by no means represent absolute facts. Opinions expressed by the host and the guest can change at any time. The views of my guests are solely their views, and the Welcome to Wellness show does not accept responsibility for them. Any action you take based on the information contained within this podcast is strictly at your own risk. The Welcome to Wellness host, Ashley Deely, will not be liable for any losses or damages in connection with the use of this podcast. You should take all necessary steps to ascertain the information you receive in this podcast is correct and has been verified. None of the guests or contributors on the Welcome to Wellness podcast will be responsible for your use of the information contained therein. Under no circumstances will the Welcome to Wellness show or my affiliates, partners, suppliers, licenses, or guests appearing on the show be liable for any direct or indirect consequences or damages arising from your ability or inability to access this podcast. All intellectual property rights belong to me, Ashley Deely, and include, but are not limited to, the copyright and any other rights in the design. You are permitted to use the Welcome to Wellness podcast for personal use, but not commercial use without license. You may not make recordings. If you breach these terms, you lose the right to access the Welcome to Wellness podcast, and you must destroy or return any copies of the recordings you've made. Guests on the Welcome to Wellness podcast may at times provide information or read extracts from third-party copyrighted work. The Welcome to Wellness podcast does not provide any medical or professional advice within these episodes. If you take any action or inaction as a result of the content you consume from the Welcome to Wellness podcast, this is based solely on your decision, and Ashley Deely, the Welcome to Wellness podcast host, and my guest cannot be held responsible or liable for any of the consequences of such action or inaction. Thank you.